here we go. We're ready to paint the heroes, y'all. Yeah, so the heroes in Mice and Mystics are these just amazing sculpts. All the sculpts in this game are really fantastic, and the heroes really do a good job capturing the character of the Mice and Mystic heroes in the game, and they're actually the primary reason why I wanted to paint this game and why I started this whole series painting the Mice and Mystics game, is because I wanted to paint these flippin' heroes. They're just so cool. So the way that I paint these heroes is I'm using a lot of the techniques that I've talked about in previous episodes of the series. And so if you're just jumping in and you're a complete beginner, I would recommend you go back and you watch the other episodes. Maybe not paint along necessarily, but like at least go and watch those episodes so you can see those techniques. This video and the videos following this video assume that you have at least some grasp of painting techniques. You're comfortable with a larger brush and a fine tip brush. Also, I'm assuming because you've been playing along with me, you now know the consistency of your paints. So if you are painting along with me using Reaper Minis paints, which are the paints that I use for the most part, or if you're using Citadel Minis paint, or if you're using Army Painter paint, or if you're using Vallejo, or if you're using like literally any brand of paint, I assume that by now you understand the consistency of your paint, and when I say thin layers, you know how much water you need to add to your paint to create thin layers. For the most part in these figures, all of the layers are thin. The key to painting these figures, the way that I painted them, is I did a lot of thin layers. The base layers are thin layers where I'm painting 2 or 3 coats of a specific color area, and I do that because if I screw up while painting these thin layers and paint an area of the figure I don't really want to paint, it's not a big deal because it's a thin layer. If I was painting with full power paint that wasn't thin down at all, and I screwed up and painted an area that I didn't want to, it'd be a lot harder for me to cover that up. And so just assume going into this, for the most part, all of the painting is with thinned paint in these videos forward, all right? Awesome. In relation to that, when you're painting with thin layers, patience is super important. You need to let those thin layers dry, and sometimes that means putting the figure down and picking up another figure, which is why for these next 3 episodes, we'll be painting 2 figures at once. So we'll be painting Nez and Filch first, and then we will paint Lilly and Maginos, and then we will finish up the series with Colin and Tilly. The good news is I have 3 more episodes to figure out how to say that character's name. On that note, it's time to start! Nez is the blacksmith of this campaign group game, if you didn't know that, and he has a nice sturdy hammer with which to hit offending rats. So he's sort of like a tank character a little bit. And then we have Filch, who is the rogue character who is actually a thief. So his character is a bit darker. He's got this nice big cloak on, and he's got this dagger in his tail, or no, it's his hand. In the game art, I believe there's a thing where he has a knife in his tail. But either way, for both of these characters, I'm basing their color scheme and art off of the player cards that go with these characters as much as I can, and still taking some creative liberties. But these 2 characters are going to have a very similar color pattern to the gray rats. Both of these mice will be gray in a fur color, and then their clothing will be either brown or like a bronzish color with some accent colors in that area. All of the colors that you need for these 2 figures are right there. There we go. The only thing that is new or different on this color pattern would be the pink. So for all of the heroes, I actually paint their adorable little noses pink and their ears pink, like the inside part of their ears, to kind of match the cover art, if you notice, of the game. So the pink, I think, is the only color that is 100% new on this. Oh, and the green, the Viper green. So this is just a standard green, and you'll see where we use that, but it's for clothing and accessory items. So yeah, if you have a not green color, you can use what you like, but again, I was trying to match to the character cards. First step, the fur. For both of these mice, Nez and Filch, we're going to be doing their fur in a medium gray tone. For me, that means Shadow Stone from Reaper Minis. For the fur, for this paint color, I went ahead and did a 2:1 ratio where I did 2 drops of paint with 1 drop of water for the medium gray on their fur. I also made sure, because they're mice, to paint their hands and their tails this same fur color. It's a little different. With rats, they have pink tails, but with mice, they actually have tails the color of their skin tone, and you can see that in the character art. I guess it's not skin tone, it's fur. But all of their like toes, their hands, their tails, and any fur parts that you can see, go ahead and paint this medium gray color in nice thin layers. Remember, because it's fur, if any paint pools, which it probably will, you want to make sure that you pull out the paint that is pooling and distribute that paint elsewhere around the figure. You don't want to lose any detail or overpaint specific areas of the fur to lose this nice etching fur texture that the sculptor has included on this mini. Some tricky areas of each of these figures would be Nez's tail. So you might notice Nez's tail is actually wrapped around him and tucked under his right elbow. And so the tip of his tail is just peeking out his right elbow. Go ahead and just paint. Get paint wherever you need to get paint to make sure that you get his tail nice and covered. If you have the tail covered in this paint color, you don't really have to, you're not going to be getting in that area with any additional paint after you paint the tail. So if you get it on the breastplate, that's fine. Well, it'll cover up because you're doing nice thin layers. Okay? The next little tricky part would be on Filch. His tail, he has his tail peeking out behind his cloak. So there's a section behind his cloak where his tail is peeking up, which means his tail is actually on the back side of the inner part of his cloak. There's just his tail just going down from his butt along the back wall of the cloak. So make sure you paint that one strip of his tail, this gray color. In addition, he has his left leg, right leg? His right leg is like half wrapped around his cloak, or his cloak is half wrapped around his left leg. And so it might look like a pouch or something like that, but it's actually his left leg. So you don't forget to paint that area. Like I totally forgot to paint that area and had to go back and repaint. So there's that. As always with humanoid figures, try not to forget the underarms, the backside of arms, or any other area that you might not normally see, like the crotch or groin area. I find it helpful to turn the figures upside down and rotate them a variety of directions to make sure that I get full coverage of the base skin fur color on these figures. Now that we've painted their fur, let's go ahead and paint their clothing, or accessories in this case. So to start off, I went ahead and painted the leather accessories that both of these characters have using a light brown. For me, that was Reaper Mini's leather brown, and I went ahead and thinned it via my normal ratio. For Nez, I went ahead and painted his belt, the straps that are holding up his breastplate, and his wrist cuffs, which I actually screwed up. So I overprimed this Nez figure and lost some detail in his legs and on his wrists/hands. And so it actually looks like on my figure, he's wearing gloves. And that worked for me because I was like, oh, he's a blacksmith. Totally, he would have leather work gloves. So instead of trying to define and regain feature via painting into his hands again, I just went ahead and painted his hands as if he was wearing leather gloves using this light brown color. If you didn't screw up your Nez Filch figure, go ahead and paint just his wrist cuffs this leather brown color and paint his hands his normal hand color, all right? Just trust me on that. Unless you want him to have gloves. I feel like for me, I had lost so much detail on his wrists that it would have been tricky for me to go ahead and like repaint that detail myself just because I had overprimed by so much. So my Nez has leather gloves on, and if that works for your Nez, go for it. Otherwise, paint some hands. For Filch, he doesn't have much accessories on him. He has 2 belts, both of which I painted this light brown, and he has 2 pouches. I painted the larger pouch on his left hip, the leather brown color, and then the other pouch I will paint later. Unless you want to paint it brown, you can paint it brown, but I painted it in a future step. These figures are covered in brown, and the next color would be a medium brown to paint Filch's cloak and Nez's hammer shaft. And so I used Harvest Brown from Reaper's Minis, thinned to my normal amount, and then I painted Flitch's cloak and Ness's hammer. And Ness's hammer, I just made sure to paint just the shaft, and I didn't forget to paint the little nubbin on the top of the stone. That's important, right? You don't want to forget that. You also don't want to forget the ends of the stick, which I totally forgot and had to go back and paint. So that's all that we're really painting of this medium brown color on Nez. On Flitch, go ahead and paint his entire cloak. So I personally love painting cloaks. I just really like painting flowing fabric. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. I like to use a thinning technique, which I'll show you here in a minute, that I think it gives really bang for buck. And to start it off, we need a good base color that is kind of like a medium tone of what we're going for an overall color. So for this one, it's a medium brown cloak. Make sure you paint the inside of his cloak between his legs. Make sure not to get it on his tail. Also, you don't want to get it on his tail on the outside of the cloak, and you want to make sure that it doesn't pool too much in the crevices and cracks and folds of the cloak. His hood is up, and so I tried to paint very carefully around his ears and the top seam of his hood. But if you get it on his face, you can quickly dab it with water and soak up the paint. Because these are thin layers, it should come up pretty quickly, pretty easily if you catch it in time with water. Thinned layers, again, are key, and for me, I painted the cloak about 3 times. I did 3 layers of my medium brown color to get it the color that I wanted, where it was just evenly distributed paint. Now that you've painted everything we need to paint with that Harvest Brown color, you should have a little left over, hopefully. Go ahead and just add a tiny drop of a glittery gold color, which for me is Antique Gold from Reaper Minis, and mix it up really good to get a bronze color. I used that bronze color to paint Ness's breastplate. He's got an apron on that is down with some tools in it, but above the apron he has a breastplate which is held on with those leather straps I mentioned earlier. I just paint the front of that breastplate this bronzy color to give it some sheen and some shine. If you want some added effect, glittery paint usually makes brush strokes really easy to see, so try to be consistent. But if you want the look of like a worn breastplate, you could have some brush strokes that go a little crazy to look like maybe scratches or dings or dents, though he is a blacksmith, so I don't know how. Maybe he takes better care of his armor, I don't really know. But for me, I tried to make it look as good as I could, but I actually screwed up at one point when I was painting the fur and got like a little bit of gray on the breastplate, and I just left it there. And when I went over it with my thinned bronze color, it actually shone through like a ding, and I really liked that look. So instead of adding more of the bronze color to cover that up, which I could have done, I just left it as is because I think it added some more character to his armor, his piece of armor. So yeah, it's just an example of how I made a happy little accident turn into a happy little accident. I don't know, I'm not good at Bob Ross. We're gonna keep painting the accessories and detail work, and the next color that we're gonna do is kind of a medium gray, which for me, or I guess it's dark gray, is Shadowed Stone by Reaper's Minis. I thinned it my usual amount, and then I painted Ness's hammerhead, which is just the big stone block. With thin layers, I used 2, I believe, thin layers on his hammerhead, maybe 3. There's some actual like denting and weathering in the stone that is sculpted in, and it looks really good, and you don't want to lose that by putting too thick of layers on. So you want to make sure your layers are thin as you're painting this. Then for Filch, I went ahead and painted his sword hilt this Shadowed Stone or medium-ish gray color as well. While you have a little bit of Shadowed Stone on your palette, we're gonna build or mix that in with some green to make a medium-ish, darkish green color to paint Ness's apron. Then I carefully painted around Ness's tools in his apron, and make sure to also paint the strings around the back of Ness with the adorable little bow that is there. For painting features like that, like tiny little strings, I just worry about painting the upper edge. And so I almost do kind of a dry brush technique where I make sure my paintbrush doesn't have too much paint on it. And then I end up using the side of the paintbrush to paint those raised edges. I don't worry about painting down the sides of the strings because those are gonna be covered up in the wash anyway. Like, it all comes out in the wash is a phrase that means a lot in painting, I've learned. So with tiny little details like that, just worry about getting the raised edges the correct color that you want, because any of those contact points where string hits fur, or even like crevices where the side of the apron butts up on a tight crook with his like thigh, don't worry about getting your green in there and potentially screwing up the fur. Like, it's gonna be fine. When you go back and add a wash, the wash is gonna seep into all those cracks and crannies and crevices, and it's going to be the blending agent for you between those seams. Remember that other pouch on Filch's belt? I use this green color that we used for Nez's apron just to paint this pouch on Filch's belt, because I think that it's a nice color accent on an otherwise pretty brown and like dark character, and the green is still pretty dark, so I think Filch would have this colored pouch. Like, his whole character and demeanor is like dark thief, and so I went with more subdued tones on his like paint, and Nez I feel is like the dark blacksmith, and so he's just generally a darker figure as well because he's sooty and dirty working in the blacksmith and stuff like that. So that's why these color palettes I think really work well together. To finish off the base paints for these two figures, we just need some shiny steel. So a metallic gray color, which in my case would be honed steel from Reaper Minis, is what I used to paint Filch's blade, and I used that same color to paint Nez's tools. So when painting Nez's tools, I just used a fine tip brush, and I basically just used the technique that I use for painting the apron strings, where I just really worried about painting the higher up parts of the tools, knowing that the wash will seep in and cover any crevices or anything that I miss on these pieces of the figure. Now for my favorite part, the wash. So one thing that you can do is if you went ahead and purchased Agrax Earthshade, which is my favorite wash and is a miracle worker in the world of washes, is you could just use Agrax Earthshade for everything on both of these figures. I didn't do that. I did, however, use Agrax Earthshade to wash Filch's cloak. Just the back of his cloak, not the inside, just the back of his cloak. Because his cloak is brown and we want it to give like a dark muddied look, I just went ahead and used a brown wash, which is what Agrax Earthshade is, for the cloak. For the front of Filch and like the inside of his cloak, as well as the entirety of the Nez figure, I actually did a black wash. So if you remember from our roaches way ago, you can make your own black wash by doing 1 drop of black paint with 4 drops of water and mix it really well. And that'll make a good wash that you can use for basically an entire figure. I went ahead and used a pre-made black wash that I have from Army Peter, I think? I can't remember. But I went ahead and used that wash on the entire Nez figure in addition to Filch's fur color, his inner cloak, and just kind of anything that is Filch. So his sword, his tail, which is technically on the outside, but it's still him, I used the black wash as well. When you're washing these figures and any figures, you want to make sure that the wash is being evenly distributed around the figure. It's okay if stuff pools for a little bit and then you can go back and use the brush to pull it out like magic and redistribute the wash to other areas of the figure. You sort of want all the seams and crooks and crannies to have an equal amount of wash in them, because if you have one nook or cranny that has more wash, it'll look a little weird. It'll look like maybe that's a darker area. I don't know. If the part of the figure makes sense to have a darker area, then okay, but in general, you sort of want to just keep a consistent, even amount of wash distributed around the figure. These figures look so good with the wash now, don't they? I absolutely think wash is just like the miracle maker. But we're gonna take it up a level, so we could stop here. But we're not gonna. We're gonna take these figures up a notch, and not too far, which is the tricky part. It's when to know to stop. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna do some highlighting on both of these figures. We're gonna do a bit more highlighting on Filch, and that's because of his beautiful flowy cloak. So let's talk about Nez first, because his highlights will be much easier. Nez's finishing touches is super easy. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to take that metallic gray color, or if you have a metallic silver, like polished silver from Reaper Minis, we're going to use that on all of Nez's metal bits to just bring the color and shine up on those tools. So using a very, very thin layer and just kind of like the tip of the brush, I just did highlights on the edges of the tools in Nez's apron to make them really shine and catch the eye after that wash dulled them down.
With the polished silver, I also painted Nez's earring, which you may have missed. It's on his right earlobe up at the top, and I just did a quick layer over the top really quickly, didn't worry about going down the edges, just enough to get it to have a glint and a shine when it hits the light. In addition, I brought the tone of his breastplate up by just painting a thin layer, kind of haphazardly, of that metallic gold on his bronze plate, just to give it a little bit more sheen and shine after the wash dulled it.
In addition, I dry brushed the edges of Nez's hammer using honed steel to give it some glint and shine, like he'd been banging it against some heads, you know what I'm saying, and scuffed it a little bit. I mixed a little bit of shadowed stone and I thinned it with 2 drops of water to 2 drops of paint. And then I went ahead and added in a little bit of white, little tiny bit of white. And I just did some building up highlights, similar to how we did building up highlights on the rats. This shouldn't be nearly as wet as a wash, so you want to make sure that it doesn't recess and pool in the lower areas of the figure. You just kind of want to paint all of his fur in this thin down layer, but not with too much paint, just enough to bring the tone up a little bit. And once this layer has dried, if you want to make him a little brighter, guess what? You just do another layer with this slightly brightened shadow stone. And that's basically all I did to Nez. Yeah, looks good. Sweet. For Filch, there's 2 things that we're going to focus on. Number 1 is Filch's fur color. So Filch is actually a little brighter than Nez, and we see this on the character cards, and I think this is one of the reasons why he has such a large cloak, is to hide the fact that he's not as dark as he wishes he was for his thieving purposes. So I just did some building up highlights on Filch's fur. If you feel comfortable going up even further, you can add more white to make a much lighter gray color and then do a dry brushing on the fur areas of Filch to really bring his color up. I attempted this, then didn't like the results, so I quickly used water to take the results off and then decided I was happy with where he was. The next part of Filch is probably the most time consuming, and that would be bringing up the layers on his cloak. The cloak is beautiful. I love well sculpted cloaks, and this cloak is definitely well sculpted. But the wash brought the color down a little bit, which isn't really consistent with how the cloak would really be covered. The higher edges of the cloak that are folded in such a way would be a little brighter, and so we're going to create that effect by layering paint, similar to how we layered the centipedes and the spider legs. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the base color that we painted the cloak, which was a medium brown. In my case, Harvest Brown from Reaper's Minis. Then we're going to add a little bit of a light brown, which for me was Leather Brown, also from Reaper Minis. And then we're going to thin it to about 2 drops of water per 2 drops of paint, basically an even ratio of thin layers. And you want it to be a thin paint. You might even want to add not quite a 4th drop, I'm not really sure, but we want a nice thin layering consistency. And then you're going to layer the ridges of the cloak that are up. So similar to how we did the spider, where we didn't go all the way down the legs when we were darkening and building up those layers, we're doing the same thing but with a lighter shade. So you're not going to go all the way down into the crevices of the cloak, you're just going to stay on the upper ridges and keep those lower levels darker. But you're just going to do a nice thin layer on the upper edges of the cloak, around the hood, the top seams, the back shoulder area, anything that would be higher than the deepest part of the cloak. You're going to add a nice thin layer of this new brown mixture. Then once that layer dries, you're going to do it again, but you're going to paint a little less this time. And I mean like a little less, like 1/2 millimeter less on each side of this stroke. And you're going to keep doing that, and you'll see a real difference in the color tone of the cloak building up for the dark recesses where it's folded up to the billows. I guess it would be called the billows. I hesitate to offer this suggestion, but you can also add a little bit more leather brown between each layer if you would like. but that might accelerate the growth of the color a bit faster than you're looking for. For me, I ended up painting about probably 8 layers, maybe 9 or 10. I really lose count of this cloak, building up to the final layers of just almost a leather brown color on the very top ridges of the figures, of the bellows on the cloak. And even then, I didn't paint that color on every top ridge, just the ones that I wanted to catch the most light or have the appearance of catching the most light. So the ones on his like back, right, and the top of his shoulders, not all the way down his back towards his tail. I didn't paint those the lightest color. This is a layering technique that I use on all of the heroes moving forward, starting with Filch. I use it for every hero that comes after in this series, just for varying degrees. So if you're not down for this technique, I'm sorry, you can truncate it a different way, but the results are pretty impressive, and all it takes is patience. You don't even really need a steady hand, though it will help you with your brush techniques and learning the control and angles of the brushes that you need to reach the effect that you want in kind of a low risk manner. Like if you screw up these layers, it's not that big of a deal actually, because they're so thin and they're building up on layers of brown underneath them. It's not going to be like, oh, I painted white on top of a black area. Like it's I painted brown on top of a brown area that was slightly less brown. Oh no. So again, patience is key with thinning these layers. And if you start to feel like you're running out of paint or your paint is getting too thick, always just add a drop more of water. And I do that quite a bit while I'm painting these sort of layered buildups. With that, we're basically done! The only thing left for these actual figures would be to do their ears, their nose, and their eyes. So for me, I used pink to paint the inside of all of the hero figures' ears and their adorable little noses. If you want, you could paint all of the heroes' eyes and noses and ears at the same time, or if you're like me, you could paint them now because it's better to show off the figures when all of the bits on the figure is done. So for this, I just used pink, and I used, I think it's called like Emperor's Children, or I don't even remember. It's a pink from Citadel, and I just thinned it a little bit with paint, but not too much, and I just painted the inside of the ears on all of the figures with a thin layer, and then I also painted their tiny adorable noses. And I sort of just made up where the nose was for each figure. And then I painted their eyes. And so with this, I used a black for the eyeball, and the eyeball should be nicely popped out because of the wash making it stand out. So I just used the very tip of my best pointy brush to just paint kind of like in a circle around the eyeball on all of the eyes. And then as an added bonus, I tried something for the very first time and it worked. And if you want to try it, go for it. And if not, no pressure, because you can always paint over it or use the oh, I screwed up technique. But when the eyeballs are dry, when the black is dry, I went ahead and got my nice pointy brush, which I'll link to down below. It's brand new to me. It's actually a makeup brush. Like it's for eyeliner. It's for like painting eyeliner on your eyes. And I was like, if ever there was gonna be a brush that had a really good pointy tip that would last, it's gonna be that. And it works. Like, it works. So thank you, Terry, for that tip. But I took this very pointy brush and I put a little bit of white on the end, and then I just very, very carefully painted the glint in the eye. And for each of these characters' eyes, I had a very bright light behind me, and I held the figure and I looked at what was already being reflected off of the paint, and I just painted the glint there on each eyeball with the figure facing me the way I wanted it to face me so that it would look like it was looking at me. And so now my figures look like they're looking at me, which is creepy, but also awesome because it succeeded. So yeah, just a tiny little white dot in the eyeball where you want the glint of the eye to be, which will be where they're looking. The glint is basically how they're looking. It's sort of like the iris, but not really, but sort of. And that's it! Nez and Filch are done, except for their bases. Their bases we'll paint later. Basically, because we're painting all of the heroes, I actually painted all of my hero bases at the same time because I wanted their base colors to be super consistent. So I just wanted to mix one batch of base paint at the same time for all of my heroes, all 6 of them. And so I hold off on painting the bases until the end of the series when I'm done painting all the other heroes, and I'm kicking a box. However, if you would like to paint your bases, you can do so now. Just make sure if you want all of your hero bases to be the same color and consistent, you make a good note someplace the exact ratio that you use for mixing the paint to achieve the color that you want for the bases. For me, that was 2 drops of red to 1 drop of dark gray. So I used 2 drops of Mephiston Red from Citadels and 1 drop of Shadowstone from Reaper Minis for my base colors. Except for I did that times 3 because I painted all my bases at once later. There you go! There are the first 2 heroes painted. I hope this video was helpful for you in painting your Nez and Filch figures, or at least being inspired to come up with whatever techniques or paint color combos you would like for painting these figures. These are your figures, and it's your paint job, and do whatever you want. Paint them purple, I don't care, but I hope this video helped inspire you at least, right? If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, make sure you're subscribed. And these are the paints that we'll need for the next episode, which won't be next week, it'll be later this week, and you can find all the paint down below in the doobly-doo if you want to copy and paste it. But next episode, we are painting Lilly, who is my favorite character, and Maginos, who I might also be mispronouncing. But these are the colors that we'll need for painting those figures. Nothing really new or interesting for the paint colors that we'll need except for the red and the dark brown. You could mix your own dark brown by mixing black with a medium brown if you would so like, but I use Murfang brown from Citadels if that's your thing. But yeah, a dark brown is needed, and then a red, and then also the green that we use this week, you're gonna need that next week. Basically the idea is you'll need like 1, maybe 2 new colors every week for each additional figure. That's kind of the idea that I was going with. So yeah, make sure you're subscribed to make sure you don't miss out on that episode there, which will launch sometime this week. I don't know when. Maybe Tuesday? Is Tuesday good for you? As always, I love seeing your pictures and hearing about the progress that you're having while painting these figures. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to email me the pictures or questions there at TheOneTAR@gmail.com, or you can send them to me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Also, you can ask any questions down below in the comments. I try to respond as quickly as possible. If I'm conscious, that means I respond pretty quickly, unless I'm at work. But if I'm unconscious or at work, you just gotta wait until I'm not unconscious or at work, and I'll respond as quickly as I can. So, yep. All right, that's it for this week, or this episode, and I will see you all in a couple days. Bye!